All right, so good morning, guys. I'm Jordan Dukart from Discovery Garden. Today we're going to be talking about Islandora 7.8 migrations, or how we learned to stop worrying and love Drupal Migrate. Do some quick introductions. So myself and Adam Vessey, who's the lead developer at Discovery Garden, will be presenting. Adam has 9+ years of Islandora and Drupal experience. He occasionally feels meta programming is the meta. And I'm software architect at DGI, like I mentioned, and 8+ years. So a quick overview of our company. If you're not too familiar with us, we've been around since 2010, and we were founded out of the Islandora project at UPI. And we managed the project until the formation of the Islandora Foundation in 2013. To date, we've performed more than 500 installs for over 200 clients. And our staff have a cumulative 100+ years of experience, and we've helped clients protect 100+ million files. And more specific to this context of this presentation, we've helped migrate out of the end-all be-all of things from DSpace, Digital Commons, ContentDM, Hydra/Samvera, the end-all be-all. So it's a quick agenda of what we're going to kind of touch on today. What is ETL, ELT, and why approach migrations with these paradigms? What is Drupal Migrate, and how does it handle ETL? And like a lot of other topics today, like Alex Sanders' previous presentation, there's a lot of Drupal Migrate here. And our approach to using Drupal Migrate for an Islandora 7.8 migration. So quickly, for those of you who may not be super familiar with Drupal Migrate or kind of, how it approaches migrations, we'll talk about ETL and ELT. So when we're talking about ETL, we're talking about first extracting the data from the original systems, transforming the data into a form accepted by the destination system, which, as Alexander highlighted previously, allows for data cleanup and normalization to occur, and it's realistically the time where you want to do it. And I believe Jonathan actually touched on this as well in his presentation. And lastly, you load the data into the destination system. So the only thing that differs in ELT is that you're flipping the order of the last two actions. So first the data is loaded into the destination system, and then you transform it. So again, quick Drupal Migrate overview. It's a core module, so it ships with Drupal core, defining an ETL process to get content into Drupal. It's broken down into 3 phases, which they call source, process, and destination. Migrations are denoted in YAML, and it utilizes the Drupal plugin API. So it allows other modules to define their own custom actions as needed. And obviously, Migrate, Islandora, and other modules have existing plugins that can be leveraged. So, again, in Alex Anders' example, he wrote his own, mods XML parser. It also supports high watermarks, which allows for iterative runs. So you can only update the entities that have changed on future iterations of your migration. And you can also do rollbacks. The one big be aware here is that it can be potentially destructive depending on how you're defining your migration. So for what we're going to demo off a little bit later, if the FOXML files aren't read-only and you roll back, it's going to nuke your FOXML files. So that's kind of a gotcha from our perspective. So quickly touch on what exists in the community right now. I believe Danny Lamb has a presentation later on about this, so I'm not going to go too in-depth. So the Migrate 7x Claw module exists, which has some example migrations and plugins. It's intended as a starting framework that is meant to be built upon. It uses Solr as a discovery layer for the migration. So in the Migrate 7x Claw module, and also what we're kind of doing as well with ours, Islandora's data model is applied on top of Drupal's, which does enforce ordering of which the migrations are in. So entity references, for example, taxonomies, need to either get created or looked up as they're encountered. Files need to exist before the media can be made for them. And then the nodes need to exist before the media can be created. So here's a little demo video. Hopefully I'm sharing my audio so you guys can have a peek at this. So for some reason the audio doesn't come through, let me know. I believe I shared it correctly. And Islandora Online attendees. Today I'm going to be doing a quick showcase of Discovery Garden's Islandora 7 to Islandora 8 migration tool. We're going to take a pretty simple sample collection that you see here. It has just some basic images with some pretty sparse metadata. And we're going to put this into our Drupal 8 site, which currently doesn't have any content. So for this migration, we're going to be utilizing archival FOXML that we exported from the other system and have it living on our local storage. You could also mount an S3 bucket using S3FS and reference FOXML files that way. It's also theoretically possible to expand on our current work and have this parse, say, the object store directly. But for the purposes of this demo, we're just going to look at this local FOXML. So really quick, I'm going to walk you through kind of what the DGI Migrate module has. On the surface, it doesn't look much different than a lot of the other migrations that you'll see, in the sense that it's a collection of YAML files kind of defining the migration. Quickly, I'll just show off the first migration definition that we're using. And as you can see here, we're pointing to the local directory and calling all of our wonderful process plugins. Some of these obviously are things that we've written ourselves, and we'll touch on that a little bit more when we get back to the slide deck. So to trigger this migration, I'm going to use a little helper script here. But realistically, it's just calling a drush command and targeting our FOXML to nodes group. So I'm going to trigger that now. And it'll kick off the drush process, and we'll start getting some output as this goes. And as you see, it originally starts by ingesting the FOXML files so we can reference these later. And then it begins to start constructing the nodes that we want in Drupal. So at this point, we're also getting the content files in, which are the files that we reference on the media. One thing to note is that even when this migration finishes, the derivatives will still be running in the background via Crayfish. So those obviously need to kind of finalize before this is actually considered complete. So with this done, I'll refresh our Drupal site, and we'll see that we now have content, which is great. So one of the design decisions that we made was the idea of these migration stubs. So if in a migration process, if a entity is encountered that doesn't already exist in the repository, it'll create these stub objects that are unpublished by default. And they're really pretty much a stub, but they do contain a reference to the PID that it came from in the old system. So in this case, this object was included in our export. So the intent here being that you could come back at a later time and clean these up, or at least be aware that this has happened. So I'll take a quick look at this Empire State Building object, and hopefully the derivatives are complete for it. Just ignore this. This is a known false fly system bug. So as you can see here, we have our lovely Empire State Building and the little bit of metadata that we moved across. And you can kind of see here, it's a member of a few collections, and has some description and just some basic stuff that was mapped for just a sample demo here. The last thing I'll show off is when I referenced earlier that we store the actual FOXML itself here. You can see that there is this intermediate file with the application XML. And if we were to actually look at this, assuming I can view media, it is our lovely FOXML file. So yeah, at this point, I'm going to go back to the slide deck now, and we'll have Adam talk about some of this in more depth.
Hello. So somewhat glossed over in the example demo there was how we export our things. Just figured to mention we do have a small module, Islandora importer exporter, which includes a couple of drush commands to perform just that, the import and export of FOXML in various formats, including the archival format from the Fedora that's referenced from an i7 installation. The export commands being relatively simple, they just kind of accept a list of PIDs, which you can easily scrape out of an object store. You could pass a list of PIDs to the commands using something like parallel to get some fairly simple multi-processing up and running. One note there, though, is that dealing with archival FOXML, dealing with encoded large base 64 encoded streams, which gets kind of memory intensive in Fedora. So it may be necessary to bump up what's allocated there. In our proof of concept migration, we've made use of Migrate Plus, which is a library of additional plugins and mechanisms to help share config between individual migrations. This module is already in use by Islandora's core defaults. To facilitate things, we've rolled some mostly native PHP parsers to make use of the exported FOXML. Using archival FOXML, we could hypothetically produce a lossless mapping, including all the audit trail mapping, the version or revision mapping for all the data stream content. Also, keeping the original archival FOXML in Drupal would allow for other iterative processing migrations, pulling bits in the new system if they're needed in the future, and assuming you don't do initially a completely lossless migration. The base source plugin we used in our proof of concept migration was the Migrate directory. It's a Drupal contrib module, just does that. It scans a source directory so it can pattern match to pick up the file names that need to be processed. We have a handful of different plugins, quite a number actually. The biggest one though is we have one to actually parse the FOXML in the PHP. It is an iterative parser to avoid keeping the whole file in memory, which again with the large base 64 encoded data streams need to avoid. I have a couple other small plugins to work alongside, including XPath processing kind of things to be able to pull things out of mods and TC or whatever other XML data streams that may be encountered. One caveat, the reason why it's mostly native transforms is mostly native PHP, because we did encounter a issue with the PHP stream filter implementation for base 64 decoding, in which it forces it to load the entire stream being decoded into memory. So to avoid doing that, we kind of stream it out to OpenSSL to perform the base 64 decoding streamwise. And this last slide is just something of a visual representation of the different migrations in the migration group, but should possibly be taken with a grain of salt. Just kind of reinforcing like, yeah, files need to exist before the nodes and media, and nodes need to exist before the media, so everything can make their references to each other appropriately. Furthermore, with these dependencies described in the migrations, you can just have the migration group run as a whole, and it can resolve the dependencies between the migrations and run them in the correct order. Just something of a side note, have the media entities there being optional. Wouldn't strictly have to create them. It does create that stronger binding if you were to do other processing outside of migrations to Omni FOXML. However, yeah, it's optional. Not really sure what else to say on that. At the end of the migration, you could always, if you're happy with what's in Drupal completely, like all the things in the nodes and media and whatnot, you could go and later delete those media entities that represent the FOXML in Drupal. Also the file entities that represent the FOXML in Drupal, just to free up resources for other purposes. And I think that's it.
Yeah, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them.
First question, with this method, is there a chance for cleaning of the data in the migration?
So, and Adam, you can hop in here if I misspeak. So kind of what we're aiming for, Chris, is doing like more ELT than ETL. So if the FOXML, if you're storing the FOXML and you're using that to kind of drive as the source of your migration, you could iteratively run these if you realized, you didn't map something the first time, you may have screwed up the mapping. And I think Jonathan talked about this in his presentation as well, but like, yeah, you could be like do processing like under the hood with what we're doing. It's still the Drupal Migrate. So if you wanted to, clean up your data using like the row safe hooks that Jonathan highlighted, or just handling that yourself when you're doing your mapping, it's something that Drupal Migrate itself is kind of there and supports. And what I can say while we wait is, obviously, if any questions, you can email there on the screen, or I'm around in the Islandora Slack channel pretty frequently. The intent, I believe, and obviously you have to confirm this, but we're more than likely going to open up our plugins, at least, for parsing FOXML and potentially doing the XPath. Oh, there you go. That's funny, John. Yes, I'm just talking about that. So, yeah, I mean, the intent, I think, is to open up our plugins at least. And I know Alexander also talked about having like a mods XPath-esque plugin, which is likely very similar to what we're doing. But yeah, they're not open right now. The plan is to open them up, I think.